This is the story of Daniel Price and his sister Chloe Price. There are families that fall apart loudly through screaming matches and slammed doors and lawyers in gray suits. And then there are families like the Prices, who came apart the way old photographs do. Slowly at the edges first, the colors bleeding out before anyone thought to notice. Daniel had spent the better part of his adult life trying to understand how a family could love one another so completely and still choose, when it mattered most, to believe the worst. He had wanted for a long time to believe that his parents were simply deceived, that Chloe had been brilliant and convincing, and that no one could have seen through it. But the harder truth, the one that lived in the marrow of his quietest nights, was that they hadn't tried very hard to look. This is a story about betrayal, yes, but more than that, it is a story about what we owe the people we love, and what happens when the answer turns out to be less than we thought. The Price household, when Daniel was growing up, had the particular warmth of a place that believed in itself. His mother, Margaret, made Sunday dinners from scratch. Roast chicken with herbs from a pot on the windowsill. Mashed potatoes that took 40 minutes and tasted like effort made edible. His father, Robert, coached Daniel's Little League team for 3 seasons, even though he worked 50-hour weeks at the accounting firm, and he never once complained about the early Saturday mornings. They were not a perfect family. No family is. But they were, in the ways that seemed to matter, a present one. Chloe was 4 years younger than Daniel, and from the time she was small, she possessed a quality that is difficult to name without sounding unkind. It wasn't manipulation, exactly. Not at first, not in any calculated sense. It was more like a gravitational pull toward the narrative that served her best. When she cried, the whole house reorganized itself around her tears. When she succeeded, the celebration was immediate and full. When she failed, the failure always seemed to belong to someone else. A teacher who hadn't explained properly, a friend who hadn't been supportive, a circumstance that had conspired against her. Daniel noticed this the way younger siblings often notice things about older ones and older ones rarely notice back, quietly, with the confusion that he filed away and didn't examine too closely. He loved her. That's the part that matters. He genuinely loved his sister. By the time Daniel was 26 and Chloe was 22, they were both adults living separate lives that still circled back, reliably, to the same family center. Daniel worked as a junior project manager at a mid-sized construction firm in Portland, methodical and steady in the way he did everything. He was the kind of person who kept his receipts, who responded to emails the same day, who paid his rent 3 days early out of habit. He had a small apartment with good light and a used leather couch he was quietly proud of, and a life that was modest but genuinely his own. Chloe was finishing a degree in communications that she had stretched across 6 years, changing her minor twice and her advisor once. She was charming in social settings, the kind of charming that makes people feel seen for the first 15 minutes. And she was, in fits and starts, genuinely funny. She could also be careless with money in ways that she rarely acknowledged, spending in the rhythm of someone who trusted that the floor would always hold. That autumn, their grandmother Evelyn passed away and left behind a small inheritance, distributed equally among the family. Daniel's portion came to $11,000, not transformative money, but meaningful. He put $9,000 into a savings account and spent $2,000 on a new laptop and a weekend trip to see a college friend in Seattle. He told his parents this, plainly, over a Sunday dinner in October. 3 weeks later, Chloe told their parents that $6,000 had gone missing from her share and that Daniel had taken it. She didn't storm into the room with accusations and a raised voice. That was not Chloe's style. She brought it to their mother first, privately, in the kitchen after everyone else had gone home, her voice low and wounded, her eyes doing that particular thing they did when she needed someone to come toward her. She said she wasn't sure, that maybe she was wrong, that she didn't want to cause trouble. She said she'd noticed the amount missing from her account after Daniel had borrowed her laptop for an hour during that last Sunday visit. She said she'd found, on that laptop's browser history, evidence that he'd accessed her banking portal. She said she felt sick even bringing it up. Margaret, who loved both her children and who would have walked through fire for either of them, chose in that moment to believe the daughter who was crying in front of her over the son who wasn't in the room. Robert, when told, asked 2 questions. Not enough questions. 2. By the time Daniel received the phone call, the verdict had already been quietly reached. His mother's voice on the phone was careful in the way that voices become when people have already made up their minds and are performing due diligence. He remembered the exact quality of the silence before she said Chloe's name. The way it felt less like a conversation and more like a notification. He denied it. Of course he denied it. He walked them through his bank records, his transaction history, the weekend in Seattle and the laptop purchase and the savings deposit. He sent the documents in an email. He offered to come over in person, to sit at the kitchen table and go through everything line by line. His father said they needed time to think. They never called back to say they believed him. There is a particular texture to being estranged from your family that people who haven't experienced it tend to misunderstand. They imagine it as a loud, ongoing wound, something raw and bleeding. The reality is quieter and in some ways more corrosive. It is the absence of small things. It is realizing, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, that you don't know if your father's back surgery went well because you read it in a cousin's social media post and not because anyone thought to tell you. It is Thanksgiving becoming just another Thursday. It is this strange arithmetic of holiday cards, receiving none, sending none, wondering each December if this will be the year. Something shifts and then arriving in January with your answer. Daniel did not collapse under the weight of it. He was not that kind of person. He went to work and managed his projects and kept his apartment clean and called his friend Marcus in Seattle every few weeks, and he built, slowly and deliberately, a life that did not depend on his family's presence at its center. This was both a survival strategy and, he recognized in his more honest moments, a form of grief management, the grief of people who are still alive, which is somehow harder to name than the other kind. What he did not do, and this surprised even him sometimes, was obsess over Chloe. He thought about his parents more than he thought about her. He thought about his mother's voice on the phone, that careful, rehearsed quality, and about his father's 2 questions, and about how neither of them had looked at his bank records with the same scrutiny they'd apparently extended to Chloe's tears. He didn't understand that for a long time, and then one day, sitting in his car outside a grocery store for no particular reason, he thought he understood it a little better. They hadn't needed to investigate because the story Chloe offered fit a shape they already had. The responsible one accused the careless one of something. It was probably the other way around. He fit the profile of the accused better than he fit the profile of the wronged. That thought did not make him angry. It made him tired. In year 2, he dated a woman named Simone for 8 months. She was a high school art teacher, warm and perceptive, and she had a habit of asking questions that got underneath things. She was the first person he told the full story to, not the summary version, we had a falling out, we're not close, but the actual thing, with the grandmother's inheritance and the laptop and the phone call and his father's 2 questions. She listened without interrupting, which he hadn't expected, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "What do you think would happen if one of them just called you? Just called and said they got it wrong?" He thought about it honestly. "I don't know," he said. He paused for long enough that Simone looked at him sideways with a slight furrow between her brows, not impatient, just watching. "I don't know," he said again, quieter. Maybe I'd need to sit with it. Or maybe He stopped, and something shifted in his face, just briefly, in a way that was hard to describe. He glanced up, not at Simone but slightly past her, as though something at the edge of his awareness had caught his attention. He said, almost to himself, "I don't know. Maybe share this or something I don't know. That probably sounds strange." Simone blinked. "What?" "Nothing." He shook his head, and the moment passed the way small, strange moments do, absorbed back into the ordinary texture of the evening. "I don't know what I'd say." That's the honest answer. They stayed together another 3 months after that, and then they didn't. for reasons that were nobody's fault particularly and involved mostly geography and the timing of things. In year 3, Chloe got married. Daniel learned about this through Instagram. In year 4, his parents moved to a smaller house in Connecticut, downsizing after Robert's semi-retirement. He learned about that through the cousin as well. He sent his parents a card each year on their anniversary. Not a long card, not an emotional card, a simple one signed with his name. He was not entirely sure why he did this. He thought it might be stubbornness, or love, or some combination of the two that didn't have a clean name. In year 5, a woman named Patricia Chen, who worked in financial compliance and had gone to college with Chloe, sent Daniel a LinkedIn message that he almost didn't open. Patricia's message was 3 paragraphs long and had the careful, over-considered quality of something that had been drafted and deleted several times before being sent. She explained who she was, an acquaintance of Chloe's from college, not a close friend, and then she explained that she worked now in financial fraud compliance and that she had recently, in the course of an unrelated professional matter, come across something she felt uncomfortable keeping to herself. She'd found records, not conclusive evidence of a crime, she was careful to say. The statute of limitations on anything prosecutable had passed years ago, and she had no official standing to act. But records nonetheless, a chain of transactions from 5 years prior, accessed through a shared professional database her firm used, showing that the $6,000 Chloe had reported missing had in fact been transferred, in 2 increments, 3 days apart, to a personal account held jointly with a man named Trevor Holt, who had been Chloe's boyfriend at the time. Trevor Holt, who had gambling debts. The browser history on Chloe's laptop that she'd shown to their parents. Patricia had heard the story through mutual acquaintances, had been fabricated using a spoofed session cache, a technique basic enough that it required nothing more than a few hours and a YouTube tutorial. Patricia said she wasn't sure what to do with this. She said she thought Daniel deserved to know. She said she was sorry it had taken this long to surface, and she meant it in the particular way of someone who had no personal guilt in a situation, but felt the weight of proximity to it. Daniel read the message twice. Then he sat very still at his kitchen table for a while. He didn't cry. He noticed this about himself, that he'd expected to feel something eruptive and instead felt something that was closer to recognition, like reading the final chapter of a book you'd already half known the ending of. The grief had happened already, across 5 quiet years, in small installments. This was not grief arriving. This was grief being explained. He called his mother that evening. Not impulsively. He sat with the decision for several hours first, made dinner, washed the dishes, stood at his window looking at the street. When he called, she picked up on the second ring, and there was something in her voice when she heard his. A kind of held breath, a weariness, but underneath it, unmistakably, relief. "Daniel," she said. "Hi, Mom." The silence between them lasted long enough to be honest about all the things that hadn't been said. He told her about Patricia. He told her about the records. He didn't tell it dramatically. He used the same flat, precise voice he used in project meetings, laying out information in sequence. He heard his mother's breathing change partway through. He heard near the end the particular sound of someone pressing their hand to their mouth. When he finished, she said, "Daniel, I know," he said. "We should have." "I know, Mom." Another silence. And then, quietly, she said, "What do we do now?" It was a real question. He could hear that it was real, that she was genuinely asking, not performing, not angling. She was 63 years old and she was asking her son what came next. And there was something in that inversion that was both painful and, in a very small way, clarifying. "I don't know yet," he said. "I'll call you when I do." He hung up gently. Not with finality, just with the careful, deliberate motion of someone who understands that some conversations need to end before they can mean anything. He didn't call Chloe. He didn't call his father. He washed his coffee mug, put it on the rack, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. Chloe found out that Daniel knew the same way most things happened in the Price family's adjacency, through their mother. Margaret had called Robert first, then Chloe, then, apparently, had spent 3 days barely eating. Daniel didn't know any of this directly. He learned it in pieces over the following months through the cautious channel his mother had opened. Weekly calls that were tentative at first, mostly surface, both of them feeling their way forward like people walking in a dark room they knew the layout of, but still weren't certain about. Margaret told him things gradually. Robert had broken down when told, not dramatically, but with the particular quiet devastation of a man who had prided himself on fair judgment, discovering a foundational failure of it. He'd gone for long walks in the weeks after, which Margaret described with the specificity of someone who had watched and not known how to help. Chloe had at first denied it, then she'd partially admitted it. Then she'd constructed around the partial admission an elaborate architecture of justification. She'd been desperate, Trevor had pressured her. She'd meant to come clean once she paid it back. She hadn't thought her parents would take it as far as they did. This was probably all partly true, Daniel thought, which was what made it so difficult. Chloe was not a simple liar. She was a person who had done something wrong and then built, layer by layer, an understanding of herself that allowed her to remain someone she could look at in the mirror. He'd heard through his mother that Chloe wanted to speak with him. He considered it for 6 weeks. Not angrily. He was past the phase where anger was useful, and he'd never been a person who confused anger for clarity anyway. He considered it in the same methodical way he considered everything, taking the question out, examining it, setting it down, coming back to it. What would he gain from a conversation with Chloe? Understanding, maybe, though he thought he understood already. Closure, perhaps. Though he'd come to distrust that word, which promised a door that fully shut and usually delivered only a door that sat awkwardly ajar. He thought about what Simone had asked him years ago. What do you think would happen if one of them just called you? He had his answer now, and it was not the answer he'd expected when he was 26 and sitting in his apartment waiting for his father to call back. His father did call eventually. In the 4th month, the call lasted 40 minutes and was the most difficult conversation of Daniel's adult life. Not because his father was unkind, but because he was genuine. Robert Price was a careful, principled man who had made an error so large it had cost his son 5 years. And he did not minimize it or explain it away or ask for absolution. He said, "I got it wrong. I got it badly wrong, and I will have to live with that." He said it and then he didn't follow it immediately with anything else, which was the most honest thing he'd said in the entire conversation. Daniel appreciated the honesty. He said so. He did not say, "It's okay," because it wasn't, precisely. Not in the way that phrase is usually meant, which is, "It is now," as though it didn't happen. It had happened. The 5 years had happened. He had become a different person, partly in the gap his family had left, and not all of those changes were bad. That was the strange and uncomfortable truth he'd arrived at. He had built a life he genuinely valued. His apartment with the good light, his work, which he was good at and which he cared about, a small chosen collection of people who knew him without family mythology attached. He was not grateful for what Chloe had done. He would never be grateful for it. But he was, he realized, all right. The conversation with Chloe happened on a Thursday afternoon in November, 2 years after Patricia's LinkedIn message, because Daniel took his time with it. And taking his time was one of the few things he had never apologized for. They met at a coffee shop midway between their respective cities. Neutral ground, his suggestion. She was already there when he arrived, which he hadn't expected. Chloe had always been the person who arrived after the room was warmed up, who made an entrance even when she didn't mean to. She looked older in the way that people who've been carrying something look older. Not badly, not dramatically, just with an additional weight behind the eyes. She was wearing a dark green coat he didn't recognize. There was a coffee in front of her that she hadn't touched. He sat down. He ordered tea. They looked at each other for a moment with the specific awkwardness of siblings who had skipped 5 years of the ordinary maintenance of knowing each other. "You look good," she said. "You too," he said, because it was true. She prepared something he could tell. She had the quality of someone who had rehearsed, which he didn't hold against her. He'd have done the same, but what she said in the end was simpler than he'd expected. I've thought about what to say to you for 2 years, and I don't think any of it is enough. Probably not, he agreed. She winced very slightly. I was desperate, she said. That's not an excuse. I know it's not an excuse. Trevor was. She stopped. I'm not going to blame Trevor. I made the choice. I know. I didn't think they'd. She stopped again. I thought they'd ask more questions. I thought it would blow over. I kept telling myself it would be temporary, and then it wasn't. And then too much time had passed, and I didn't know how to. She pressed her lips together. I'm sorry, Daniel. He looked at her. He looked at her for a long time, the way you look at something you want to understand accurately. I believe you, he said, and he did. He believed she was sorry. He believed the original act had been born of desperation, and that the long silence had been born of cowardice and the particular human capacity for not looking directly at the things we've done. He believed she was a complicated person who had done an uncomplicated wrong, and that neither of those facts canceled the other. So what now? She asked. It was the same question their mother had asked, the same words, the same genuine uncertainty. I don't know, he said. And he meant it. I'd like to. She hesitated. I'd like to try, if you're open to it. I'm not asking for everything to go back to how it was. I know it can't. Chloe. He said her name gently, without edge. I'm not angry at you. She seemed to exhale at that. But I'm not going to pretend the 5 years didn't happen. I'm not able to do that. He picked up his tea, set it down without drinking. You took something from me, not the money. That was never the point. You took 5 years of my family. You took my parents believing me. And somewhere in there I had to learn how to be okay without any of that, and I did learn it, and I'm not willing to unknow it. She was very still. I'm not going to sit across from you at Christmas and act like everything is normal, he said. I can't do that. It would require me to pretend I'm someone I'm not anymore. Are you saying you never want to see me again? Her voice was careful, not pleading, careful. I'm saying I don't know what I want. I'm saying I need to not commit to anything, and I need you to be okay with that. She looked at him for a long time. That's fair, she said finally, and something in her voice when she said it made him think she'd been hoping for a different answer and was choosing not to ask for it, which was, he thought, the most genuinely mature thing he'd ever heard her say. They finished their drinks. They talked after that about ordinary things. His work, her daughter, a film they both apparently seen without knowing the other had. It was not comfortable, but it was real, which is a different thing. When they stood to leave, she hugged him with the tentative quality of someone who isn't sure they have the right. He let her. Outside, the November air was cold and direct, and he stood on the sidewalk for a moment after she'd gone, watching the traffic pass. He did not feel resolved exactly. He did not feel finished. He felt the way you feel at the end of something long, not emptied out, not relieved, but slightly lighter, as though he'd set down a bag he'd been carrying so long he'd stopped noticing its weight until just now, when he wasn't holding it anymore. He walked to his car. He drove home through the early dark. He made dinner from scratch. Nothing elaborate, just pasta and something from the pantry, and ate it at his kitchen table, alone, without the television on. The apartment was quiet in the way it usually was, which he had come to understand was not emptiness. He washed his dishes. He stood at his window. He thought about calling his mother and decided he would tomorrow or maybe the day after when he had more words for what the afternoon had been. He thought about Simon's question, "What do you think would happen?" and thought that she had been right to ask it, even though neither of them had known at the time what the answer would cost to find. The city outside his window moved in its ordinary way, cars and light and the far-off sound of someone's music, and he watched it for a while before going to bed. He slept well, which surprised him a little. And in the morning, he woke up as himself, which was, he'd learned, more than enough.